Let me talk about the background of what we'll, of course, be getting into today. I'm going to talk mostly about the causes of World War I and its outbreak. We'll talk about some of the early stages of the war, at least up to maybe up 1915, 1916. We'll get into that, and World War I was the first of these two world wars that happened in the 20th century. Yeah, World War I, a very bloody conflict, not quite, like I said, as bloody as World War II was. The years for World War I, by the way, from 1914 to 1918, led to about 10 million soldiers, at least 10 million combined on both sides. That influenza pandemic that happened at the end of it, you might be looking at 20, 30 million or more combined total. Some even say 40 million. I'm not sure about that. Well, those are more conservative estimates of probably 10 to 15 is usually what they sometimes say. They had different names for the war. Of course, today they call it World War I or the First World War, but back going to, I guess, before World War II, they call it the Great War. That's what the veterans called it from that war. And a lot of people thought it was the war to end all wars because it was considered the worst war that was ever fought in human history up to that point. And so nobody thought they'd have a worse war than that one. But, of course, we had World War II, of course, later as well. So God forbid we have a World War III. What would happen, of course. Now, I'm going to first talk about like the causes of World War I, which there's quite a lot that actually occurred that led to World War I. Some of these are long-term causes, which we'll talk about those first, and then we'll talk about the one that they're just talking about in that little short video, which, you know, the assassination of the Archduke. That's pretty much the main thing that really sparked the whole war in the end in 1914. I'll get to it later, but a lot of it was because of these rivalries that were going on between all the great powers of Europe, which I was talking about last week in the 19th century. You had all these powers in Europe that were either becoming unified or powerful rivals of each other. France, you see there, Britain, Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and also Ottoman Empire, which was weakening at the time between the 19th and 20th centuries. And yeah, Germany was the one that really set off things, I think, which really led to the war later, because the rise of Germany is really what changed the whole balance of power in Europe. I'm going to go ahead and first talk about what some of the causes were. I'll show you this right here, but usually these are the main causes that led to World War I later. Some people call it mania, if you want to call it that. Militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Yeah, we talked about the 19th century being the century of isms, nationalism, imperialism, militarism. Those kind of things were the things that kind of led to eventually causing World War I later in the early 20th century. But entangling alliance systems between these different sides, later the Triple Alliance versus the Triple Entente. So you have all that kind of going on at the same time. And so all that kind of helps to later lead to the war later. And then on top of that, you've got also other issues that we'll talk about later that are also there. I'll go into some of the causes first. We'll do first, which is militarism. We'll start with that one. As a major cause. A lot of it goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Both these different alliances start to have an arms race before World War I, where they built up larger, more deadlier war machines and armies, powerful navies. You get like different kinds of weaponry that start to come about that really lead to this in the end. I'll look at some things right here, but developing like tanks, new kinds of artillery, new kinds of battleships. Like I know Britain and Germany got into this arms race of building dreadnoughts, which were these types of battleships that were popular in late 19th, early 20th century. But airplanes, you get that kind of weapon. Also, they start to use in warfare. Submarines also being used. Poison gas. Of course, we got that too. We'll get to later. But yeah, here's some examples of some of the things that were involved in the war. So you got new kinds of machine guns that can fire what says 300 bullets per minute. They had some that could fire like 500 to 600 bullets per minute, which made obviously it difficult to take the other trench on the other side and you get mowed down. chemical weapons were used a lot, like especially mustard gas was a popular agent that they used during the war. Of course, U-boats, we just talked about the submarine, which the Germans used a lot in World War One. Zeppelins, yeah, that's something the Germans did use. They used Zeppelins to drop bombs on Britain during the war, which was true about that. Flamethrowers, of course, I just mentioned about that. The tank was, I think, used eventually by 1916 during the War, Battle of the Somme. Of course, the airplanes on the bottom also being used. So all those kind of helped to make World War One very bloody. In the end, it became more of a defensive kind of warfare because of that. In Europe, that kind of formed, that really went back to the 1890s. I think it's when a lot of this started, and I think actually 1880s and 1890s to be exact. So you got these different alliance systems that you have that create kind of a chain reaction war between the different powers in Europe. Kind of show you this, but you've got on one side, you've got this triple alliance that formed, which was mostly, you can see in that central part of Europe between the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Later, it was called the Central Powers, by the way, during World War One. Italy, when World War One broke out, actually dropped out of it. They didn't support the Central Powers during the war. And Italy was replaced by the Ottoman Empire, and then also Bulgaria also joined it as well. But they do know that the Triple Alliance went back to the 1880s, and this alliance was partially created because of the rise of Germany, and they sought like allies against France and Russia. Then on the other side, you had also the Triple Entente, which actually they think the Triple Entente went back to about 1894, when France and Russia allied with each other. And then 1907, Russia allied with Britain. And so that was the beginning of the Triple Entente, as the French later called it. But when World War One broke out later, it became known as the Allied Powers, was the term they used. But they used also that term in World War II as well. But other powers would join it besides France, Russia, and Britain. You had Serbia, Romania, Italy, the United States, Japan. Those were countries that were all pretty much in it in the war. So that's the map of what the war looks like when it breaks out. But Italy would stay neutral at first and then switch to the Allied side later in the war. Now, they got another better map showing you right here. But yeah, Italy's going to end up on the other side. You can see the ones that are all Allied versus Central Powers. Of course, you see put that better map probably with that one. Yeah, I was talking about from last week about imperialism. That's another issue that really also helps the cause of World War One, because you got all these rivalries where they're trying to create colonies all over the world, like in Africa, Pacific, Asia. And I know in Africa, when World War One broke out, you get the Germans fighting against the Allies there. And so, yeah, I guess with imperialism, that kind of makes it more of a world war with that whole issue with that. Then you've got nationalism, which we've already talked about a little bit already from last week as well. Nationalism is, of course, another major issue that really leads to why World War One broke out. It also was the major cause of World War II. All these extreme nationalists like the Nazis and fascists and things like that helped cause it as well. And we talked about how the unification of Germany, the unification of Italy were leading causes of that. Also, you had the dual monarchy of Austro-Hungarian Empire, things like that. But the big thing was Germany. In fact, Germany was rising to power in Europe. It was offsetting the balance of power everywhere. Well, Germany was trying to compete with Britain and other powers. And that's, they think, would help cause World War One in the end. Now, I'm going to get to it next. I'm going to, of course, talk about the other big cause that really leads to World War One eventually breaking out, which is, of course, we've got the Archduke Franz Ferdinand being assassinated. That's pretty much one of the main things, of course, I'll get to today and talk about that really helps cause World War One in the end. So, yeah, that's the fifth cause, obviously, which the assassination, by the way, you can see took place on June 28th, 1914, Sarajevo, Bosnia, which I think now Bosnia-Herzegovina, I think is the name they called it. But Bosnia at the time was actually part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire where this actually incident happened. And so this particular assassination really changed everything. And of course, they think it didn't just cause World War One. They think it caused pretty much the rise of Hitler later, probably because of that, and probably caused World War II. And so pretty much the way Europe is later was caused by this one incident where one man shot him with one bullet. If you imagine that. Of course, there's been a lot of paintings depicting the Archduke being shot right there. Of course, I can show you that right there. It's been dramatized quite a lot. And yeah, both of them were shot. We'll get to it later, but his Archduke and his wife were both shot by Gavrilo Princip. And a little background about the Archduke. He was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was married to this woman named Countess Sophie, who I think it was what they call a morganetic marriage, where she was below him in social standing, which was controversial, I guess, when he married her. So he almost married a commoner in a sense. But they had been married about 14 years, and it's a tragic story. But the day they were assassinated on, which was January 28th, was their 14th year wedding anniversary, believe it or not. And of course, they do think if he may have not been assassinated, he may have been actually a pretty good ruler, believe it or not. But he actually went there because they were doing this official visit to Sarajevo, which Bosnia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I think, since I want to say 1908. And I think they were also doing troop exercises near the actual Serbian border. I'll get into and talk about who was behind it. It was a secret organization that was in Serbia that was called the Black Hand. They were believed to have been the ones that actually planned the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. They were kind of like the Slavic nationalist group that wanted to create like a greater Serbia, or what would literally be what we call Yugoslavia, of course, after the war. They thought that shooting the Archduke might lead to that. And there was a man that you see at the top left there. His name was Dragutin Dmitrievich. He was a colonel in the Serbian army. I want to say Serbian intelligence, based at Belgrade, which is the capital of Serbia. And anyway, they think he was the one that planned the assassination. They used mostly young men. They were, I think, mostly teenagers, like Gavrilo Princip, that went over there. I think Princip was actually part of an organization called the Young Bosnia, which I think wanted to unify Bosnia with Serbia to create like a Yugoslavia later. They were called Black Hand because some of their actual posters they would put on the, walls, whatever, had a black hand on it. And so it got the name of that. And they had a motto, which was union or death. If you know about the Balkans, by the way, which is that whole area where, kind of pretty much like under Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, around there where Bosnia is, it was like a powder keg of Europe. And there was a belief that a big war would break out there one day. I think some people think Eastern Europe with Russia fighting Ukraine, that could create a bigger war. It could. It could be like World War III or something like that. And you had a country like Serbia, which was pretty much an independent kingdom. They wanted some of those other Slavic areas to join with them to create like a greater Serbia or Yugoslavia. And so a lot of this tensions between Austria-Hungary and all these Slavs, that had a lot to do with why the war broke out in the end. But here we go. Here's, of course, the picture there of the Archduke and his wife. Of course, like I said, they came to Sarajevo June 28th, 1914, to tour the city. And, of course, they didn't expect anybody to shoot them, that kind of thing. And that's the actual car that they rode in. So it's a convertible, I think a 1911 Grafin Stift is the name of the type of car that they were shot in. Similar almost to the Kennedy assassination. Kennedy was shot in a convertible, if you know about that. 1963. And apparently there as much about the assassination, which is weird about it. There were actually two attempts on his life. There was a first attempt where they mentioned how that little short video, how somebody threw a bomb at him, which was this man here, Nedeljko Kabranovic, who was part of that Young Bosnia organization with Gavrilo Princip, and the bomb failed to kill him. I think it bounced off the car, blew up in the street. A few people were wounded from the incident, but it was a farce. I'm trying to kill him at that point. And you can see that image there, I think, at the top where they're coming out of the, I think it's like they went to go visit the mayor of Sarajevo. They're going to get back in the vehicle because I think the Archduke decided that the best thing they ought to do is go visit the wounded. They were kind of harmed by this bomb. I think he probably should have gotten out of town at that point. And so that's what they were doing. They were on the way to the hospital, basically. And that's when that second incident happened. Of course, we're talking about where Gavrilo Princip, you see right there, he was 19 years old. He's a 19-year-old teenager, by the way, Bosnian Serb, basically was in a cafe, walked out, and there's the car. Of course, walks up to him and shoots him, pretty much point-blank range. That's the pistol, by the way, used to shoot the Archduke and his wife. It's a Browning semi-automatic pistol, still got it. And I think they say he fired the first shot. He was trying to shoot the Archduke and hit her, and then he shot him. I think she was shot in the stomach, and then the Archduke was shot in the neck. And that's an image. They think that might be the arrest image. Princip, there's been debate about who that was actually that the police have right there that they're dragging in. But they do know that the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, it's going to end up helping to cause World War I with both of them being killed with that incident. So it really upset Austria-Hungary. They were angry about this after both they were killed. And so within like less than a month, what ends up happening is with them being upset with it, they at first gave Serbia an ultimatum to turn over the men. They were involved in planning it in Serbia, which I think the Serbians were pretty much going to okay whatever ultimatum they wanted in the war, but a lot of the military, Austria-Hungary, didn't want to do that. They wanted to go to war. I think they had been already planning to invade them anyway. I think there was troop exercises that were being done right near the border of Serbia. And so on June 28th, you can see the date, 1914, they invade Serbia, of course, and that's the beginning of World War I at that point. But nobody realizes it's going to be a bigger war. I think it looks like it's a war between Austria and Serbia at that point in late July of 1914. But it's going to, within a few days, it's going to blow up into, of course, a bigger war. Now, I'm going to get to that next, kind of what happens to really allow that to occur. Here's kind of image right there with that. Oh, and by the way, it didn't go. I'll get to it later, but they invade Serbia, and it doesn't go well. They don't do well militarily in the war. Austria-Hungary. In fact, they pretty much lose badly in the war. But one thing that comes out of the whole invasion of Serbia when Austria-Hungary declares war on them on July 28th, it brings on a diplomatic crisis in Europe, which a lot of people either call it the July crisis, or I think some people call it the July ultimatum as well. And so both sides frantically start trying to stop it, but their militaries pretty much get the ball rolling. And it's just what ends up happening is you get this deal where both sides, the Germans and the Russians, start to come into the war. They start mobilizing their forces. And Russia is concerned about Serbia because Serbia is Orthodox Christian. They're also Slavic in background like they are. And so they basically decide to come into the war. And then Germany is an ally of Austria-Hungary. So they decide to back up that country. I think the Germans were going to basically give Austria-Hungary a blank check to basically fight the war. They were going to give money and stuff like that. And so that's what really caused the war to really blow up in 1914. I think if you know about the ruler, I think there's a story where the rulers in like Russia, Nicholas II, and also Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany, they tried to stop it. I know Nicholas tried to send telegrams to Germany to try to end the war. So-called Nicky, I think they call them, what do they call them? The Nicky, it's funny about that. These telegrams they sent back and forth. Yeah, the Willie Nicky telegrams, I think they were called, or something like that. They tried to stop it, but the militaries were pretty much, it's like they wanted the war in the end. Now, I'll talk about the Germans first, because what's going to happen is the Germans are going to they're going to declare war on Russia and France. And that's really going to cause the war to expand. That's why Germany ends up getting blamed for the war. They feel like they expanded by August of 1914. What happened was, if you look at the map here of Europe and the different they got the Allied powers now forming that are in green. Then you got the Central Powers that'll be in that orange, yellow colored areas. And part of why they mobilized the Germans was they were worried they were going to have to fight a two-front war against the Triple Entente. So the Germans are going to have to fight Russia in the east. They're going to have to fight France and probably Britain in the west. So they got this issue to deal with. Later, they got Italy, of course, in the south, too, that you've got as well. And so the Russians had been worrying about this for a while, going back to about 1908, after the Triple Entente pretty much is formed. And so they had this thing called the Schlieffen plan that the Germans had been working on for a while, which was actually developed by this German general named Alfred von Schlieffen. And the military plan, you can see there, was an idea to try to avoid a two-front war with France and Russia. So the plan was mostly to mobilize a majority of their forces to invade France mostly first, take Paris before the Russians could mobilize in the east. The reason why, they felt like Russia was not as industrialized compared to like France, military not as good either. And so they realized that the French would be the harder foe to defeat. And you can see there, they were supposed to do this like in 6 weeks, that plan. And of course, it didn't work out like they wanted it to. They end up falling short about this in northern France. And it ends up stalemating, which is kind of part of why World War I is so bloody. It's because neither side's able to win in France until the end of the war. But it was a plan to try and avoid this two-front war, but in the end, it ends up being bungled, of course, by the Germans. Here's a view here of the invasion. But by August, of course, the Germans declare war on Russia and France, and then also Belgium. So if you know about it, most of the Germans invade through Belgium into France and also Luxembourg into northern France. And part of why the Germans wanted to invade the northern France was because the northern part of France was the most industrialized. Those were areas that they wanted to take first. And then obviously take Paris like they did in 1871 during the Franco-Prussian War. So it's almost like similar to that war a little bit. Although I think the Germans invaded more from the north instead in this war. Initially, the most important battle associated with the beginning of the war in 1914 is really the Battle of the Marne, which you can see there took place between late August to early September 1914. Those are the dates, by the way, of when they declared war on Russia, France, and Belgium. So pretty much from August 1st to the 4th. And then the British, you can see there, they came into the war too. There was kind of a lot of debate about that, about whether Britain ought to go to war with Germany. But Britain was really worried about its empire, pretty much worldwide. And so they realized that the Germans might take some of their empire and stuff like that. And with the fall of Belgium, which Belgium put up a fight for a few weeks, but August 21st, it fell. And then from there, the Germans then pushed into northern France, you can see. And the British sent in forces to ally with the French to fight with them as well. By the way, the Marne battle involved something like 2 million troops combined. This is like Britain, France versus Germany in this war. It was one of the largest European battles ever fought in history so far. Last one before that was Leipzig. I think I told you Leipzig was like 500,000 to 600,000 troops that fought in that battle with Napoleon. That was the wounded, killed and wounded, like casualties. The casualties in World War I in that battle was equal to Leipzig, to give you an idea of how bloody these battles really were. And what happened was the German drive on Paris was stalled. What happened was the French military brought up pretty much all of its armies and even its reserves, along with some of the British forces that were sent over. And it ends up causing a stalemate where neither side is able really to win. And so instead of the Germans retreating back into Belgium and I guess in Germany, they decided to dig in their forces in northern France. So yeah, you get this. That's like the peak days really of the Marne battle was really from September about 5th or 6th to about the 12th, roughly. And you basically get a deal where, yeah, the Allies do push them back, I think, towards a river called the Aisne River that's above the Marne. And it ends up leading to a thing you may have heard of called they have this thing called the Race to Sea after the German offensive collapsed, where what ends up happening is the German side and the Allied side, Britain, France, etc., begin building trenches up and down their lines in part of, I guess, part of Belgium and most of France, northern France, which go all the way down to close to where from North Sea to the Switzerland. And so that's something you start seeing on both sides combined, and going to be that way pretty much between 1914 up to 1918. I think the guy in that picture that's on the left, that's Ferdinand Foch. He'll eventually be the top general on the French side in the war, probably one of the greatest heroes on the Allied side in World War I. But yeah, one thing about the war, it does create bloody trench warfare. So one thing about the Western Front, it was the bloodiest front in World War I. Somewhere between 13 million men were killed and wounded in the war on both sides combined. I think that's might be killed in the war, something like that. I think it's pretty much killed and wounded, I think, on the Western Front. But I think the second bloodiest is probably the Eastern Front. That happened with Russia fighting against the Central Powers, mostly against Germany in that war. Yeah, it's part of what led to why World War I was so bloody. Neither side could really win the war for a long time because of all the defensive trench warfare being fought. And they didn't have tanks yet. Tanks won't really come about and used until the Battle of the Somme in 1960, which I think in the end the tanks helped to force the Germans back in World War I. But also, entry of the United States also in World War I in 1970 had a lot to do with that later. I'll get to probably later in the week. Yeah, let me also talk briefly for a few minutes about some of the other, like they had different fronts that they had in World War I I'll mention about just for a little bit. But yeah, if you look at a map of World War I, they had other fronts. The other big front was the Eastern Front, where the Central Powers, which included like Germany, Austria-Hungary, also Bulgaria, fought against Russia, who was also backed by Romania. So that's an Eastern Front. You can see how in that war it didn't go well for the Russians. They got pushed back through Poland and the Ukraine. And eventually, I think if you know about it, the Germans even took like the Crimea, which you're fighting over now, I guess, Russia and Ukraine. But you can see how they get pushed back, and the Eastern Front was a disaster for Russia in World War I. It helped pretty much cause the Russian Revolution in 1917 that toppled the Tsar, the Romanov dynasty. But yeah, their defeats were pretty awful, and I forget the number exactly of how many it was, but I think like 4 or 5 million Russians had casualties in the war, which kind of helped lead to the Russian Revolution in itself right there. Just the casualty itself. In Italy, they call it different names, the Italian Front, Alpine Front, and that was a war that broke out later. I think in 1915 is when you start seeing Italy get in the war. 1950, 1916, they decided to enter the war. And Italy fought against Austria-Hungary because they wanted territory that was up in the northeastern part of Italy. And Italy also wanted some of the territory on the Adriatic Sea. So that's why they end up in the war. And they later have battles which are pretty bloody too, because if you look at that particular war, both sides suffered like over 4 million casualties. Battle of Caporetto, you may have heard of, or the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. Those are battles which really were probably the most famous or fought in the war. Italy would later end up winning that war in the end, take some territory from Austria-Hungary, but not without a cost with that. And the Balkans campaign, they had that too as well. Austria-Hungary fought Serbia, which they did not do very well with that. They invaded at first, but they got pushed back by the Allies, rebuffed by 1918. And yeah, Austria-Hungary, I think they succeed on the Eastern Front, but they lost pretty much territory against Romania, Serbia, and also Italy as well. Middle Eastern Front, Britain had allies they fought with in the Middle East. They fought against the Ottoman Empire, which we'll talk about today a little bit. They fought with the Arabs also as well. A lot of Arabs wanted to have their independence from the Ottoman Empire. So a lot of them joined up with the British to fight them. You may have heard of Lawrence of Arabia or T. Lawrence, who's famous, aiding a lot of the Arab forces against the Ottoman Empire. And that was a front that most people don't know that was fought. But a lot of it had to do with later nationalism that would later occur, especially after World War I and War II. You'll see a lot of independence from a lot of those Arab states after the Ottoman Empire breaks up. They did have an African front, by the way. Britain, France, Portugal, Italy, Belgium, like those countries like that, especially Britain and France, fought against Germany, mostly in the east, western parts of Africa. Mostly were fought with African soldiers on both sides combined. The Germans had a pretty good general that fought in Africa named Lieutenant Vorbeck, and he actually did pretty good against them, but they were outnumbered vastly by the Allied side in the war. So Germany would end up losing a lot of its territories after the war. And don't forget the Atlantic. In the Atlantic to the west of Europe, you got the German submarines, U-boats are being used to attack Allied shipping, which kind of put a stranglehold on some of their war munitions and things like that they might need in the war. And the most famous incident that came out of that whole thing with the German U-boats and unrestricted submarine warfare was the sinking of the Lusitania, which happened in May of 1915. And that was critical in the war because it later influenced the United States to join the Allies. We don't come into the war until 1917, but it obviously influenced us to back the Allies over Germany, etc. I mentioned about this before, but a lot of the German soldiers who are on the far left there, that one right there, were often called different names by the Allies. Huns was kind of a common name they started using in World War I because they were comparing the German invasion of France to Attila the Hun, who invaded part of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. They also called him Fritz because obviously Germans were commonly called Frederick the Great. So Fritz, Kraut, Laboche, both those were similar. Those were names that talked about how the Germans eat sauerkraut, with like sausage, etc. Laboche, I think that the cabbage head or the cabbage people, cabbage head or something like that, I think is what it meant because they ate sauerkraut. And so that name stuck to, I think later in World War II, they used the term Jerry also, as in the Germans as well. The French were called different nicknames. The Pelou was a name they would sometimes use. I think that's a kind of a Pelou soldier, maybe in the middle. But anyway, they called them that because they would not shave. I think Pelou meant hairy ones or something like that. And the British would call them Frog because they would eat frogs and snails. British were called Tommy. They've heard that nickname because apparently that was a common name among a lot of British soldiers, Tommy, Thomas, that kind of thing. But apparently there was a soldier named Tommy Atkins who was one of the first to enlist. And so he got that name because of that. Americans were later called either Yanks, as in Yankee, or Doughboys. You may have heard that before being used. Italians sometimes were called macaroni. I think maybe the Americans called them that because they ate pasta. And then Australians and New Zealanders were called either Aussies for the Australians, and of course in New Zealand, Kiwis. And later in the war, a lot of the Australian New Zealander soldiers fought together with the British, were called Anzacs, which I'll get to later. The Anzac stood for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, for short. It's an acronym, and that's something you start to see a lot in World War I. They start using acronyms for everything, for a lot of different things. I've got a few minutes. I'm going to talk about some various campaigns that did happen in World War I that were famous. There was one that happened mostly around 1915 that was big that occurred, which was the Gallipoli campaign. And this campaign occurred because of the fact that the Ottoman Empire had joined the war on the German side in 1914, happened in late 1914. And that changed the war because now, if you know about what happened, the Allied powers had a problem with Russia because the fact that you know about Turkey, where it is today, and the Ottoman Empire, they could now control the Dardanelles Straits that runs in the Black Sea. And that meant that they couldn't supply Russia through the Black Sea to help them against like Germany and Austria-Hungary, et cetera. And so they came up with this idea to try and defeat the Ottoman Empire, knock them out the war so they could help the Russians. So, yeah, I think it's October 1914, I think is when, by the way, when they think the Ottoman Empire joined. Italy would drop out, and then I think it's around 1915, they start backing the Allies, et cetera. And here's a map to show you a better view of what they were trying to do. The British, with some French forces, along with the Anzacs, Australia and New Zealander corps, were going to come up through the Aegean. The plan was, by the way, to take that peninsula you can see there in the map called Gallipoli Peninsula. And then what they were going to, their whole main goal, if you know about it, was to take Constantinople, Istanbul, now today. And the idea of, by the way, the Gallipoli campaign was Winston Churchill, who, by the way, at the time was not the prime minister. I believe he was, I think at the time he was, I forget what his title was specifically, but he was the First Lord of the Admiralty in the British government. This kind of hurt his career, by the way, for a while. But what happened was the idea was they were going to supply their forces, bring them up there, and show you a map here of the landings at Gallipoli. But by the spring of 1915, they would land about, I think it's like 350,000 British troops were involved in the landings, led by this general named Sir Ian Hamilton. He was the main general that led the invasion at Gallipoli. And then the French had about 80,000 troops, and then the Anzacs had about 60, 70,000 troops, they think, roughly. I can see where they fought on Gallipoli. They fought near the bottom of it, Cape Helles, you can see right there, Anzac Cove. And then there's also this bay there that's called Suvla Bay. That's on that west coast, Suvla Point right there. And there were two big battles fought in April. There was the Battle of Anzac Bay, they called it, and then also the Battle of Gallipoli. And neither were successful. They got like a beachhead that you can see there in that image on the bottom, and at the top at the left there near Suvla Bay, they were able to push inward a little bit. Germans had come in and they equipped the Turks with like artillery, machine guns. They were giving them, I think they had some generals they sent in to give them military advice on how to fight against the Allies. And I think the Allies at first, if you look at that map, tried to come up the Dardanelles with their fleet, but the Turks mined it, and they put artillery on basically on both sides, and so they blasted them, and they couldn't get up. The first plan was try to get up there by ship, and then they tried to get by land, and so neither were really successful in the end in doing that. By the way, the Allies would suffer, I think the numbers vary, but over 250,000 casualties. That's quite a lot out of that force, which was somewhere between 400,000 to 500,000, I think, total. The Anzacs themselves suffered over 50,000. Out of 65,000 men, 35,000 men were killed and wounded. And I think if you know about Australia, New Zealand today, they have what they call Anzac Day, which commemorates all these men that fought in that particular conflict. It's April 25th every year. But the Allies, what happened was because of they not able to take that peninsula at that point, by I think I want to say January of 1960, they evacuate their forces. The whole thing was a total failure by the British. Here's some images showing you part of why it was so difficult was the terrain, like where they landed. You got this mountain terrain that's high up that they had to seize. And of course, the Turks could just put force at the top and blast them, which was made it very difficult. So here's other images showing you the terrain, which kind of made it difficult for the Allied side in the war. Yeah, here's some casualties too in the campaign to give you an idea of how bad it was. So, yeah, total casualties for the Allies was 187,000, I think. Looks like it may have been the numbers. Then you got the other numbers on the other side, Ottoman Empire, about right there. But yeah, you can see the Anzacs. Yeah, that was a pretty good amount, 35,000 killed and wounded. Pretty good amount of their force right there. Oh, by the way, there was a big hero in the war. It was a man named Mustafa Kemal. They call him Ataturk, which, by the way, means father of Turkey. He was the biggest general on their side who helped them win the war. And he's important because after the war, after the Ottoman Empire broke up, he helped form the Republic of Turkey, which was created in 1923. And he went on to become the first leader of it, I think president of Turkey. And so that's why they called him Ataturk, father of Turkey. I'm also going to talk about one more thing that happened too, which was in they had a bunch of these stalemate battles that happened in the war that were very bloody. The Battle of Verdun, I'll talk about that one first. I'll talk about the Battle of Somme also as well. And Verdun was considered one of the greatest battles that was fought in World War I. It was one of the longest that was fought also as well. Last somewhere between like 10 to 11 months, to give you an idea, or 302 days. You want the actual amount of days that was fought in World War I. And it was fought in a small area in the kind of northern part of France, which was strategic because the fact that the French had a bunch of these forts that they had built on their frontier with Germany going back to, I think, the 1890s after the Franco-Prussian War. I'll show you some images right here. There's the actual dates, February 21st to December 16th, 1916. Verdun's not the bloodiest battle of World War I, but it is considered one of the bloodiest overall. To give you an idea of how bad the war was, they say that in a 10-month period, something like 30, 40 million artillery shells may have been fired by both sides in the war. That's maybe that's probably a conservative estimate. I've heard maybe it might have been 50, 60 million that they may have fired at one point, but they think that most of the casualties, a lot of the war, it wasn't like disease, it was caused by artillery fire, that you probably would get killed or injured. Why was Verdun such an important battle? It was predominantly a German offensive battle. The Germans tried to counterattack what the Allies had been doing on the Western Front between, I guess, 1914 to 1916. And it was fought along the Meuse River Valley. It was an important river that the Germans had taken before, but they had been pushed back. And anyway, I'll show an image right here of the map of the location here. You can see that it's located like the northern part of France. There's a bunch of forts that are around there that the Germans built to defend that area. Verdun was, by the way, an old medieval French town. That's famous, if you know about it, going back to the Franks. When the Franks broke up its empire, they signed the Treaty of Verdun at that site, and that's initially why that city was famous. I think 843 AD was the year. But you can see all these forts they built everywhere. You can see every those five, the pentagram, I guess that's a five-shaped fort right there, but hexagram or whatever that is. But Douaumont, Vaux, Souville, those are all kind of forts. I think they were the most strategic ones that they mostly fought over right there. And apparently, if you know about it, they only had one main road that ran to Verdun, where they supplied the Allied forces there. It was called the Voie Sacrée, or Sacred Way. And if the Germans had taken that road, that would have been it. They would have taken Verdun and probably broken through at that point. And anyway, yeah, those are the main forts they fought. Douaumont was the one I think they talk about the most. That was the most famous that they fought over. Fort Vaux, Fort Souville was another fort that was big. I think I've got an image showing the fort, like Fort Douaumont before the battle, and then you can see after, how it's basically almost destroyed, trying to fight over it. And both sides took that fort several times, like back and forth, like fighting over it right there. Here's some images showing, of course, Verdun, which, of course, are in color. That's some French soldiers, of course, fighting in the war right there. That's the town of Verdun after the battle's over. So it's just a lot of it was destroyed in the battle. Those are all the artillery shells I was talking about are fired. Just ridiculous amount of artillery shells that were fired that were just shot by both sides. Crazy. Those were the different generals that were also in the war. Erich von Falkenhayn, he was one of the top generals in the war in the Western Front between 1914 to 1960. It was really his idea to attack Verdun, and Falkenhayn wanted to use a war of attrition to defeat the French. That's what the war becomes. You know about it by 1916, 1917, where they believed that if they could kill more of the enemy, they could win the war. And so he made this comment that he was going to bleed the French white at Verdun. And he ends up trying to do that, but in the end, it's a stalemate and neither side really wins. And he later gets sacked. By the way, he's fired. They bring in Paul von Hindenburg to replace him. The French had their general, too, that was big, which is Philippe Pétain. Pétain was not one of the top generals in the army. Ferdinand Foch was the head of the combined French forces, but he was the main hero that stopped the German advance, of course, in 1916, and he was often nicknamed later the Lion of Verdun. If you know about Pétain, he's this man that's controversial because during World War II, if you know about it, after Germany defeated the French in 1940, he backed the Nazis with the Vichy French government. So he was later vilified about that. But I think if you study about the Battle of Verdun, there was a motto they started using, which is "They shall not pass." And that motto was actually not attributed to him, but another general named Robert Nivelle. But it became a motto that they used, that they, I think, even wrote on walls, and you see it on like postage cards right there. Basically, if the Germans would have broken through, that would have been it. You know, that would have been pretty much the end of pretty much the war. But yeah, here, of course, an image showing you the dead at Verdun. That, by the way, is the Verdun Memorial that was later built later. I think maybe it built after World War II, maybe later. But that was a memorial they later built to honor all the soldiers that died, of course, at that battle. Now, they do have another battle that also happened in 1916 that was pretty bloody, which is the Battle of the Somme. The Somme battle took place between July and November of 1960. This battle was more of a British battle. French fought with them too in the war. But it was like this counter-offensive battle that they fought like north of Verdun. And I think it was also done to counterattack what the Germans were doing at Verdun. They say this was one of the bloodiest battles of the war, too. Now, the Somme and the Verdun are pretty bloody, and involved something like 3 million troops or more on both sides combined. To give you an idea of the amount of forces that were involved. Now, yeah, it may have resulted in 1 million casualties or more. That's how bloody the Battle of the Somme was, but it's not the bloodiest battle of all time. The Battle of Stalingrad is in World War II. Show you kind of some images. Of course, if you know about the British, this is actually Britain's worst battle they ever fought in, like the bloodiest battle overall. Just I think about the Battle of the Somme, the first day of that battle, which I think was July 1st of 1916, the British lost 57,000 men in the first day. That's crazy. I think that's the most they ever lost. Period. 19,240 men were killed on the first day of the battle. So these battles were ridiculous. A lot of it was because of not just the artillery shells, but machine guns. You try to go over the top and take the other trench, and they just mow you down. You don't even get there. But yeah, you can see a map showing you the locations of where both battles were fought. Actually, the Allies were able to push the Germans back, I think something like 8-9 miles. They call it this big push, was the joke they had about it. And part of why they were able to push back the Germans was the British, if you know about it, introduced the tank in this battle in World War I. The tank was an offensive type weapon that'll change the war around. Does a lot in World War II, also other battles. And so that's part of why that occurred more than anything. Yeah, one thing about the impact of the Verdun and Somme battles it's almost like stalemate battles where neither side's really winning the war. And you really won't see really the Allies win the war until 1918, after the United States comes in, brings in fresh troops, and that'll kind of eventually lead to why Germany loses by the fall winter of 1918. A lot of discontent in a lot of the countries. I know in France, they actually had a deal where troops actually mutinied. They refused to fight. And there was cases where they shot some of their soldiers. I think there's a movie you may have seen called Paths of Glory. It's got Kirk Douglas in it, and they basically had that issue as well. And it led to replacements of like their politicians, like in Britain, France, David Lloyd George became the ruler. George Clemenceau took over France and things like that. And then the Germans had to reinstate unrestricted submarine because they want to try to strangle the Allies as much as they can to try to defeat them. The other thing that happened too, as well, between 1916 and 1917, the Germans realized they stayed where they were with their defense lines that they might lose. And so Hindenburg, who took over the West, became the main general for the Germans, pushed back their lines, and they built what they call the Hindenburg Line, which was a defensive line that was built there. And so that, in a sense, is what led to why the war continued longer than it probably should have. I think if Hindenburg wouldn't have done that, I think that the war won, 1917, maybe when it really ended more than anything.